So recently, Jake Tapper on CNN was interviewing a gentleman by the name of Marcus Luttrell. He is a former Navy SEAL, and he's the subject of a new movie called Lone Survivor. Now, during the interview, Jake Tapper had a little bit of commentary about the war in Afghanistan. Take a look.
One of the emotions I felt while watching the film is, first of all, just the hopelessness of the situation.
Well, I don't know what part of the film you were watching, but hopelessness never really came into it. I mean, where did you see that? Because there was never at a point where we were just felt like we were hopelessly lost or anything like that. We never gave up.
Just the sense of all these wonderful people who died. It seemed senseless. I don't mean to disrespect in any way, but it seemed senseless. All these wonderful people who were killed for an op that went wrong.
We spent our whole lives trained to defend this country, and then we were sitting over there by this country. So you're telling me that because we were over there doing what we were told by our country that it was senseless and they died for nothing?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
That's what you said.
Now, just to put this in a little more context, Jake Tapper was talking about a Navy SEAL mission that went terribly wrong. 19 people died as a result of that mission in Afghanistan, and he said that it was senseless, but then he kind of backtracked a little bit after he obviously offended Mr. Luttrell. Now, Mike, I want to bring you into this conversation. You know, Jake Tapper got a lot of heat, a lot of criticism for saying what he said, but some might make the argument that, hey, you know what, he said something that was actually correct. It was senseless. Why are we in Afghanistan when we're not achieving anything at this point? Why do you think it is that people are criticizing him when he's telling the truth? And should a journalist ever have the ability to comment on a current war that we're in, even if it's negative commentary?
Well, I think it's a very dangerous thing to say that journalists shouldn't be able to question the causes and validity of a particular war where service members and civilians, of course, are dying. With this case in particular, it's a little ironic. I mean, this is a scene or a movie about fighting against the Taliban in this area of Afghanistan. The area where he was fighting very likely now has been turned over to the Taliban. Those Taliban military commanders have likely been offered positions in the coalition government by the U.S. government. All of the fighters maybe who were captured, who fought in that battle, have bbeen turned back over to the Taliban in these concessions to try to lure the Taliban into a peace deal. And of course, this fighting against Al-Qaeda, with this essential mission in this country, but an organization being bolstered by U.S. support in other countries like Syria. And so, as a service member who went to Iraq, you could see the reaction of the ex-Navy SEAL in this film, because we really, you really search for some kind of meaning in what happened and why people died, why you lost friends. And so there's this, gut reaction to want to try to find some meaning in it. And to hear that maybe it was for nothing, of course, is something that evokes this emotional response. And so that's why he may have gotten so much heat off of it. But the reality is, you can't say it wasn't for anything. It was for something, but I think the motives seriously need to be questioned.
So, Jenny, what do you think about that interview? I mean, do you think that this is an example of being unpatriotic? I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate here, but anytime someone says something about our troops that might be a little negative, they're considered unpatriotic. We're not allowed to criticize.
Listen, I kind of disagree with that in a way. Like, if you look specifically at this instance, if I had been Marcus, I would have responded the same way. I think if you're talking about a specific operation and calling those deaths senseless after this person lived it and has to, in his mind justify the things that happened, and he has to believe that they were there for a reason. I mean, I understand that as a human being, and I probably would have told him to F off, honestly, if it had been me. However, I do think that there's an important thing. I think that Tapper took the wrong tactic. I think if you want to get Marcus to comment about overall war strategy and what we're doing there, and like looking back now that he's home and coming home and seeing that there's a lot of people who are questioning the direction of this war and the tactics that are used, does that make him feel like he doesn't understand why there's still people over there losing their lives? I think that's a better question. Yeah. And I just don't think that's an appropriate question to ask that person about that instance.
That's interesting. So CNN is obviously having a little bit of an identity crisis. They want to appear as though they're not biased in any way, so they refuse to take a side or make any strong commentary for one side or another. So I feel like Jake Tapper in that instance was kind of out of his element because he wanted to share his opinion about something, and in the process of doing that, I think that he did kind of bungle it a little bit because he didn't use the right words, he didn't approach it in the right way. What do you think about that, John?
I don't think that he bungled it. I don't think that he misspoke. I think he spoke and Marcus Luttrell misunderstood, and he misunderstood for a couple of different reasons, some of them intentional and some of them not intentional. I think he shares some of them with the sort of internet commenters who will be commenting on this video and saying how unpatriotic we are. And to portray Marcus Luttrell as just this, like the guy that was there and he's an innocent, that's I think a false narrative. Marcus Luttrell is a political figure. The book was much more political than the movie. Marcus Luttrell, a well-known friend of Glenn Beck, he's a guy who's been on record as saying he hates liberals. He can't just come in there and act as if he's just some guy. No, he's at the very least, an aspiring political figure, whether he's going to run for office or not. And I think that it's one thing to portray the speech that, say, Jake Tapper gave and say that, well, you know, how could you say this? But silence is saying something too. And if you don't speak out against the war, then you're more likely to send future Marcus Luttrells into battle. And I think the thing that's bothered me the most about this is that if you were to ask Marcus Luttrell, the Taliban who died in that battle, did they die for nothing? He'd probably be willing to say, oh yeah, they shouldn't have been there, it was stupid, it was senseless for them. And the idea that there's some inherent difference between Taliban fighters who die or French fighters who die or South Sudanese fighters that die, and that because we have some sort of divine mandate to be where we are, that it's different, is ridiculous. You can look back to almost any previous military conflict the United States has been involved in, and all have been fraught with lies by the US government. Whether the lies led us to do something good, like in World War II, for instance, or something bad, like in many of the more recent military conflicts, the idea that no military commander has ever given the wrong order, or that people haven't died for something where they shouldn't have been. Look at the entire history of World War I, trench warfare. It's ridiculous to say that people always die for good reasons.
But I think my point was that you're taking one specific mission that went wrong and trying to make a commentary about the overall situation in war and strategy, right? So I'm just saying he mixed those two things when he was talking. And yes, the operation was bungled. It didn't go right. People died. It was horrible. However, you know, missions go bad, even in the best of wars. And people die when they maybe shouldn't have been where they were. And I just think he put those two things together into one commentary, and that's what caused the confusion.
Well, yeah, you know, this was but that battle is a microcosm of the entire war, and which is why it's important for journalists to be making these types of comments at this moment, especially when we're at a point where we may be seeing extension of a U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. That's something that's very much up in the air right now. We could have this indefinite death of U.S. soldiers and Afghan civilians at the hands of U.S. soldiers on the horizon. You know, this is a situation where the U.S. government and the Bush administration thought they could make quick work of Afghanistan, saying, hey, here's a country that's outside the sphere of U.S. economic interests. Here's a country, if we plant some bases, we can exert economic domination over all of these neighboring countries who have previously been off limits to our sphere of influence. We can go in, overthrow that government quick, put in a puppet, and we'll be good to go in Iraq, and then in Syria, and then Iran, and then all these other countries that are targeted. But what happened is it blew up in their faces, and they realized that people don't want to live under foreign occupation. And so when the resistance grew and grew year by year, they realized that they had this crisis, this disaster on their hands, and these rich politicians and these military generals with their really rich friends on Wall Street, they decided they didn't want to take responsibility for military defeat, so they just kept pouring more and more bodies into this meat grinder, and that's what the Afghanistan war is today.
So we're dealing with a lot of pro-war propaganda. We certainly did leading up to our invasion of Iraq. I mean, when you think about all of the different public figures that were scrutinized for criticizing that war, I mean, it's very clear that our press did not have the right intentions. I mean, the Dixie Chicks, they spoke out against the war in Iraq, but they were totally persecuted for that. You had Michael Moore, who did the same thing. He was also criticized for it. So what is it going to take for us to fight back against that type of propaganda? Because if we have figures like Jake Tapper that get criticized for making, in my opinion, a pretty benign comment, right, and an accurate comment about what's happening in Afghanistan right now, what hope do we have to fight against that kind of propaganda so this kind of stuff doesn't happen over and over again?
Well, I think that the real problem here isn't so much that Jake Tapper's a journalist and so he shouldn't comment on Afghanistan. I think the real problem is there's this idea that if you haven't been there, you can't have an opinion. And I've seen it everywhere. I've seen experts. I'll have an expert on my show about Afghanistan, and I'll tell them about another expert I've talked to, and they'll be like, well, has he been there? And I'm like, no. And they're like, okay. And actually, when I told someone I was coming on the show, and they were like, oh, what are you going to talk about? And I was like, oh, Afghanistan. And they were like, oh, you're going to talk about all the time you spent in the trenches there? Like, there's this idea that if you haven't been there, you can't have an opinion. And it's insane. I mean, you would never go to a JPL scientist and say, oh, have you been to space? Oh, well, then you must not know. There's information, there's data, there's, you know, in this case, unlike JPL, we have people who have been, like, to the trenches in Afghanistan, or in JPL's case, you know, it would be the far reaches of space, who can say, actually, based on my experience, and we have more information to make decisions. And so it's insane to think that people who haven't been there can't have an opinion.
You don't have to go to war to know that our influence in Afghanistan has not been productive at all. You don't have to go to war to understand that our political strategy is driven not by spreading democracy, but by war profiteering. I mean, that information is out there, so that is such a stupid argument. And it is important for journalists to be critical of some of the decisions that our politicians make. That was the whole point of journalism to begin with, to keep businesses accountable, to keep elected officials accountable. And right now, what are they? I mean, if Jake Tapper isn't allowed to do any type of analysis, then what's the point of his position?
Yeah, I love the idea that firsthand experience is a prerequisite for commenting on something. Like, I've seen during the polar vortex, I've seen journalists go and just get frozen up. That doesn't make their journalism there any more appropriate or any more knowledgeable, I think. The one thing that I think would help in terms of allowing us to have a conversation about the goals of the military without it constantly being diverted into you're insulting the troops is more education for every single person in America, which is probably asking too much, because there is a critical mass of Americans whose political sophistication, particularly when it comes to foreign policy, is at such a simplistic level that they cannot accept any criticism. They have Al Franken once he had an analogy for this, and he said he was targeting conservatives there, and I think that it's pretty appropriate, but I'll say for many Americans, that many Americans, particularly conservatives, have a love for the country that is like how a 3-year-old loves their country. They just love it, and if you insult it, then you're saying it's a bad thing. Whereas he was saying liberals, but I'll say some Americans love, you know, the country like they love their mother when they're 30 years old. You can love her and still understand that perhaps she has a drinking problem and perhaps she's bad with money. That doesn't mean that you hate her. And I think that we need to reach a level where we can look at the government and we can look at the history of the United States and say that we had, you know, the black codes and slavery and wars that we shouldn't have been involved in. That doesn't mean that we hate America, and it doesn't mean that we hate individual soldiers.
It means that we love America and we want it to be a great country. The only way it can be
curing your mother of alcoholism. You want her to be the best version of herself she can be.
Exactly.
That's actual love, I would say.
Definitely. Final question goes to Mike. I'm really curious to hear what you thought about Robert Gates. So Robert Gates is promoting a new book, unfortunately named Duty, and I don't know. And in the book, he was very critical of Harry Reid for denouncing the war in Iraq. What do you think about that?
You know, Robert Gates, I mean, first of all, someone with this, you know, really illustrious military career, serving on the board of directors of 5 different corporations that are military defense contractors and oil drilling companies. Of course, no conflict of interest there in terms of his view of where we should be in the Middle East. But I mean, look, I mean, saying that the Iraq War was a lost war and a lost cause, I mean, this is just reality. I mean, looking back at a war where over 1 million Iraqis died, where thousands of U.S. service members died, where tens of thousands are maimed for life, and in a war that we know, and this goes back to the whole premise of this discussion, we know that the politicians, our elected officials, lied about the motives for the war and knew that they were lying. The Pentagon generals lied about the motives for the war and knew that they were lying. And then the mass media dutifully put up all the Pentagon talking points, had on all of the guests that the Pentagon recommended, and acted as this fourth arm of the government with this war. And so I think the legacy of the Iraq War we are seeing today, both with the homeless population of Iraq vets and the PTSD and suicide epidemic among Iraq vets, and in Iraq today we're seeing that aftermath there. The Iraq War, like the war in Afghanistan, and like all of these other secret wars that the U.S. is engaging in all throughout the region, are, in a sense, failed missions in the sense that they blew up in the faces of the actual stated goals of the politicians. But they are really this kind of scar on the face of our history now, and one that we're really just kind of seeing the results of.
Just really super quick, I just wanted to point out, you mentioned it briefly, but if we're going to talk about senseless military deaths, I just wanted to bring up for a second the fact that more active duty and veteran, military members are committing suicide than dying in combat. And if you're going to talk about real senseless deaths, I would say that that's kind of the biggest thing. Yeah. So I just wanted to remind any veterans that are watching, like, if you feel lost or hopeless, please talk to someone.
Absolutely. I think that you hit the nail on the head. I think the biggest issue when it comes to supporting our troops is making sure that men and women that are raped and molested within the military get the help that they need, that those who are dealing with mental illness as a result of their deployment get the help that they need, that we stop neglecting and abusing our veterans. These are issues that we should talk about whenever we talk about supporting our troops. But oftentimes, supporting the troops means supporting an entire war, and that just doesn't make any sense.